I'd like to welcome you to the High Museum this afternoon. I'm Michael Harris, the consulting curator of African American art here at the High Museum, and it's my pleasure to introduce to you today Franklin Sirmans, who is this year's winner of the David Driskell Prize in African American art. The prize is unique at the High. It comes out of our affiliation with David Driskell, who is one of the leading scholars and artists and curators in African American art, and he's worked in the field for many, many years. And this prize honors a contributor to African American art who is either a curator or writer or an artist. Past winners have included Kelly Jones and Willie Cole. This year's winner, Franklin Sirmans, was born and grew up in New York City, and some other places in that area. He attended Wesleyan University, and he wrote his honors thesis on Jean-Michel Basquiat. He's a curator of modern and contemporary art at the Menil Collection in Houston, Texas. And he's also mounted exhibitions prior to joining that museum at the Bronx Museum of Arts, Comune di Milano in Italy, and the Museum Villa Stuck in Munich. Some of his notable projects include Basquiat at the Brooklyn Museum, the LA Museum, LA County Museum, and the Museum of Fine Arts at Houston. He did Make It Now, new sculpture in New York at the Sculpture Center in 2005. One Planet Under a Groove, contemporary art and hip hop at the Bronx Museum, and it also traveled here to Spelman and the Walker Center in Minneapolis in 2001 to 2003. And he did an interesting exhibition, Ralph Bunche, Diplomat for Peace and Justice at the Queens Museum in 2004. Franklin has edited and contributed to numerous exhibition catalogs, including Transforming the Crown, African, Asian, and Caribbean Artists in Britain, Gary Simmons at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago. He was a contributor to Freestyle and Frequency, both shows at the Studio Museum in Harlem, and Double Consciousness, Black Conceptual Art since 1970. He's been an editor of Flash Art and editor-in-chief of Art Asia Pacific, and he's written widely on art and culture for such publications as Art in America, the New York Times, Essence, Newsweek, and he's had a fantastic and broad experience for someone so young. I'm waiting for him on his next visit to Atlanta to bring his golf clubs to see how he is in that area. But until then, I give you Franklin Sirmans.
How do I follow that? Thank you, Michael. And yes, we definitely will be doing that in the near future. Thank you all for coming today. I also have to say thank you to Ashley Toddy and Virginia Shearer in the lectures department and programs, and to Michael, of course, and Kevin, who will be helping me. We actually had some interesting technical difficulties, but I think it'll be okay. Let's see. Basically, I'm going to let these images pertaining to Jean-Michel Basquiat go by. I kind of want to read through about 15, 20 minutes to give an idea of some initial thoughts, some sort of theory for which to be working on. It's sort of appropriate to have the Basquiat images going by. One of my sort of first introductions to visual art and to artists in particular was through going to exhibitions at places like Peg Alston, Ken Keleba, and these are galleries in New York City. And a lot of the artists that I met around that time was at a very actually early age, and I guess that's because my father was interested in their work, were artists based in a sort of abstract expressionist tradition. A lot of them were sort of coming out of a school of Norman Lewis, and that includes artists such as Al Loving, Ed Clark, Joe Overstreet, Bill Hudson. Lots of great artists who, some of them continue to work. And I think they were speaking to a generation that was very much aimed at, say, my father's age. One thing happened in 1985 as a student in high school and someone who had recently moved from New York City to the Westchester suburbs, but still trying to remain in touch. There was, in February of that year, Jean-Michel Basquiat was on the cover of the New York Times Magazine. And it just sort of really, really touched me in the way that I think my father could relate to certain of those other older artists. Basquiat was somebody I could automatically relate to, somebody who was speaking our language, somebody who understood our music, and somebody that I really wanted to continue to look at. And of course, since that time, I did my thesis on him 6 years after that, and did the first retrospective at the Whitney, working as an assistant, and then just recently co-curated the last Basquiat retrospective that started at the Brooklyn Museum. So that said, when I was little, I'd say around the age of 7 or 8 or just about, I had a bad habit of sitting in my room, I guess somewhat silently. My mother would frequently ask, "What's wrong?" And I would reply, "Nothing." I like to feel that now. The extended answer was, "I have nothing to say. I am observing and I have nothing to say." I often feel exactly this way today. So it's not odd in hindsight that I've somehow made a living in observing and writing. I've often felt, and of course, more than ever in front of audiences like you, today, that I began writing to articulate that which I could not communicate orally. Please don't think I mean to say that I chose to write about art for its allusions to the aha moment, like, it's so beautiful, and that's all I can say. Whatever that means. No, the idea was to figure it out in writing. Likewise, it is also to place oneself amidst objects and ideas that can't be easily explained, even by well-thought-out words. And I don't know if you've seen this, but apparently this weekend in Marseille, a woman was arrested for kissing a painting by Cy Twombly. This is hilarious, people. We're going back to the aha moment. The aha moment is something that, we have this inexplicable sort of emotion come over us, and it is most often described as this moment where people cry, like in front of a work of art. In this case, this woman felt compelled to actually kiss this painting. I think that's another sort of aha moment. And yet another anecdote. When Walter Hopps asked the critic Leo Steinberg to talk about Robert Rauschenberg 40 years after he had first written a review, and though he only intermittently followed the artist thereafter, Steinberg replied, "I have nothing to say." Of course, he would go on to figure out something to say, and it is published in an incredible little book called Encounters with Rauschenberg. So by now, I am sure you are thinking about what I was thinking when I was told about this lecture. So I went into literature and art as a way of forcing myself to say something. Rare is the curatorial talent of a David Driskell or a Robert Storr, who can actually have a gig in both making and presenting art. I took the other popular route, with poetry as the base. Like countless others, that base is in writing, and the art was just something to write about. Reviewed books and records first, but when you have nothing to say, it is best to write about art because there's nothing to quote. It will force you to figure out something to say. And although I never realized it, until the artist Charles Gaines invited me to a conference on it, the criticism I was trying to write was a practical criticism, a form of criticism that made use of the past and precedent, but that was also willing to speak in other terms about other histories to other people, often instead of the usual suspects. That being said, I want to talk about a personal approach to art history and art criticism that hopefully will lay a foundation for thinking about art. And simultaneously, or at least after the fact, an approach to looking at art via putting together shows or curating exhibitions. Art theory was cool in a 1998 movie called High Art, starring Ali Sheedy. It also can make good money, which is absolute nonsense. But it can be sexy, which is good enough. Though the movie is from 1998, there are others. Legal Eagles with Robert Redford, of course, Pollock, Basquiat, and the brilliant Pierce Brosnan movie, The Thomas Crown Affair, where René Magritte's quintessential bowler hat-wearing everyman becomes literally everyman, while Brosnan replaces a stolen painting at the Met. But let's picture a time when America knew little about modernism and in fact played second fiddle to Paris. Even though Duchamp and his ready-mades, everyday objects designated as art and placed in the appropriate context, lived in New York by 1915, and the Mexican muralists went full-scale in the United States by 1925. But Clement Greenberg, America's modernist art critic of record, missed Duchamp and his little circle of taste and art for art's sake. I forgive him for that short shrift he gave the Mexicans, whose highly political murals influenced countless others with their own racial utterances. The space where Duchamp's art of concepts and ideas intertwines with Mexican political murals finds resonance to varying degrees in all American art since World War II. As Steinberg wrote in 1968, American art after this period is unthinkable without this liberating impulse towards something other than art. For me, the approach also lies in the latter years of the 1960s, when the radical gesture was perhaps more than a public relations move. In this period, which has been referred to as post-68 by Laura Cottingham, naming and the application of written words to artistic developments became complex in a way that typical readings applied from the Western concept of historical linearity no longer held water. In literature, music, and art, the circle with no beginning and no end became as prevalent a reading as a chronologically drawn line with a clear beginning and end. This period was characterized by titles like earth art, body art, video art, happenings, performances, process art, and even book art. These words are usually written in small caps to delineate the fact that they were names or for works in progress. Kim Levin wrote, "The styles of modernism have now become a vocabulary of ornament, a grammar of available forms along with the rest of the past. Style has become a voluntary option to be scavenged, recycled, quoted, paraphrased, and parodied, in effect to be used as a language. In looking now at art as a remix of the past, we can think of Ralph Waldo Emerson, who wrote self-referentially in 1875, "The originals are not original. The first book tyrannizes over the second." Or Roland Barthes' rap on signifying in speech, or even Derrida, who said, "Pluridimensionality does not paralyze history within simultaneity. It corresponds to another level of historical experience, and one may just as well consider, conversely, linear thought as a reduction of history." Or it can also be linked to the culturally cannibalistic discourse behind Brazilian music in the 1960s. popularized under the banner of the Tropicalia movement, itself a remix from a 1920s manifesto, or, like hip-hop's origins in the 1970s, embracing cultural exchange through remixing, cutting, pasting, in creative, social, and geographical boundaries. While the first happenings were spurred by post-World War II factors, the political, economic, and social events of the late 60s lent a new urgency to the production of art that was anti-Greenbergian and contrary to art's elitist longings and perhaps present longing. The desire for art to play a political role was manifested pointedly in the very nature of the anti-market happenings, actions, events, and activities associated with the creation of art, of an ephemeral nature, and the more market-based art of objects. Harold Rosenberg saw the moment as a development to the extremes of the action painting idea, that a painting ought to be considered as a record of the artist's creative processes rather than as a physical object. It is the event of the doing, not the thing done. That is the work, he said. Maybe Rosenberg mythologized Pollock and overstated the case for Pollock actually being a performance artist. But I like this statement for its clarity and find that it is helpful in describing parallels between what Pollock did and what many graffiti artists have done with cans of spray paint and more impressive feats of physicality in the name of action painting and civil disobedience. As a curator, one way I've sought to affect some of these ideas is through exhibitions, conflating popular culture and visual art. I began thinking about a show of contemporary art that explored the cultural subject matter of hip-hop around 1993, after having worked on the first retrospective of Jean-Michel Basquiat, the Whitney. I was drawn to the subject in much the same way I was earlier engrossed by the subjects of Basquiat's highly autobiographical works, ideas and images. They spoke to me in a way that most of the art shows I was attending did not. By the late 90s, the idea for a show on hip-hop turned into a way of making a critical fiction around the culture via the art. Something new, perhaps interesting, more interesting than an homage show of artifacts and fashion. Believing that the hip-hop I was referring to was already dead, allowed for a critical reading showing artists of great differences with collective meaning for a broad public. Having seen the artifacts and fashion show come to fruition in the 2000 exhibition, Hip Hop Nation, Roots, Rhymes, and Rage, which originated, unsurprisingly, at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in Cleveland, Ohio, the market potential and mass appeal of such a topic was already demonstrated. Several earlier exhibitions also paved the way, notably identity-based shows like the 1993 Whitney Biennial, Thelma Golden's 1995 show, Black Male. Both of these exhibitions demonstrated currents in contemporary art that were largely being overlooked and were extensions of a curatorial school of thought based in an application of multiculturalist theory. From the late 80s and early 90s, also including the exhibition The Other Story, London, 1989, and The Decade Show, New York, 1990. Later, Peter Weibel's 1996 exhibition, Inclusion, Exclusion, set the tone for globalist discussions that would be further laid out in big international biennials the following year. Some of the questions that came to mind: in order for a show of contemporary art that addresses more popular and/or political concerns to be successful, need it be based in material culture? Where were the thought-provoking artists who were engaged with a popular discourse and still held their own in the rarefied air of contemporary art? Where did visual art meet the art of music at the end of the 90s? Had hip-hop already killed its original performative nature? The idea from the outset was to select and mix a series of works that spoke for themselves. They had no need for giant wall labels and long-winded curatorial explanations. There's a passage at the beginning of the book, The Painted Word, by Tom Wolfe, where he says, What I saw before me was the chief critic of the New York Times saying, "In looking at a painting today, to lack a persuasive theory is to lack something crucial." It didn't say something helpful or enriching or even extremely valuable. No, the word was crucial. I like Wolf. I like the fact that he doesn't trust art criticism. So although it would be concept-based, it would not be at all crucial to have a background in either hip-hop music or contemporary art, for that matter, to enjoy the show. So this is sort of the idea around 4 or 5 exhibitions that I was fortunate enough to work on in between 2001 and actually the present, because one of them is up now. The first one was One Planet, Under a Groove, Contemporary Art and Hip Hop. And that started in 2001 at the Bronx Museum, and actually came here, I guess, in 2002, thanks to Andrea Barnwell at Spelman. The second one was Mass Appeal, which was a smaller show that traveled to 4 different cities on the northeastern side of Canada. And then Ralph Bunch was in 2005. Last summer, Trevor Schoonmaker and I did an exhibition called The Beautiful Game. And that was at 2 exhibition spaces under the name of Roebling Hall in New York City. And that was specifically based around the World Cup. I'll actually show some images from that in a minute. And then lastly is an exhibition that is up now in Hartford at the Amistad at the Wadsworth, which is called For the Love of the Game, Race and Sport in America. And some of the artists in that show include actually that Basquiat Joe Louis piece is in the exhibition there in Hartford. Other artists include Gary Simmons and people like Rashid Johnson. So, I'm just trying to show some slides from One Planet first. Of course, this is Keith Haring, DJ 84. One of the things that we were thinking about with this exhibition was, you have these artists who are solely identified with what is something that we were calling hip-hop around that time. People like Keith Haring and people like Jean-Michel Basquiat, who were obviously sort of coming directly out of this culture, not only coming out of it, but actually directly creating it. This piece, in fact, relates to Haring's murals that were done actually in clubs. And so there was always this idea of actually living with the work and people being in movement around the work, not just a static object. But yet, of course, it is because of the static object that we still, we talk about Jean-Michel Basquiat. I think the last auction record was 6 point something or 7. We talk about him because he left all of these objects. We don't talk about Tracy 168. We don't talk about, all of these graffiti artists who sort of had their moment in the sun, showed that at Sidney Janis, and didn't leave that much behind. The sort of essence of that work being so often based in the ephemeral. You're presented with this sort of conundrum. This is a 1984 piece called Toxic, and Toxic was actually a graffiti artist and friend of Basquiat. As I said, I started thinking about a show of hip-hop in 1993, and really, was completely clueless, actually. This is a photograph by a dear friend and artist named Lisa Leone from 1992, and it's a portrait of the rapper Biz Markie. So, first thinking about this idea of doing a hip-hop show, there was no concept behind it. It was just, we love this thing, and there's all this information and material, so we can just show photographs of it and let it go with that. Very bad idea. I actually pitched it a couple of times, got into an argument with Harry Allen about it, actually, and the show kind of died. So this is a piece by Corinne Simpson, and this piece actually is from an earlier hip-hop show that was very much based on the visual imagery of photography. But then we began to look at and think about conceptual artists like Adrian Piper, for instance, and artists like David Hammonds. And slowly you could see how these older artists, although they were not necessarily the progenitors of this culture, were very much a part of it and were making commentary about it, and to this day feel a certain closeness and relation with many of these artists. And this is a work by Gary Simmons, and again, him being sort of a younger conceptual-based artist, based in New York, went to Cal Arts, sort of coming out of a generation that is, sort of equal parts of a hip-hop sort of origins or something, but at the same time has a certain stance that is, he can stand back on it. I mean, this piece actually are these sort of fetishized bronze sneakers, which is really about, the sort of idiocy of young people stealing sneakers and how we place nothing on a life, et cetera, et cetera. This is a work by Renee Green. It's called Import-Export Funk Office. It's from 92 to 93. And this is just one of the most monumental conceptual, I think, works of the early 90s period. I mean, this whole, basically she's created an entire archive in which, up until that point, she collected magazines, ephemera, memorabilia, everything as part of a sort of discussion base. And within this office, there were also headphones for listening and videos for looking. So it's just this sort of almost monumental sort of museum. This is a work by Martin Wong. It's called Sharp Paints a Picture. And, and I talk about how, on one hand, how graffiti artists have been excluded from so much of art history. And we actually, for better and or worse, I'm not sure, but we actually did not have any sort of real graffiti work in the exhibition. Sharp would have been one of those artists who probably should have been in the show, but we were interested in trying to look at work that we thought was vibrant at that moment and sort of accepting the fact that being based in more ephemeral surroundings, that it was not going to be a good idea to document this outside work with photography. So instead, we have this painting by Martin Wong, which sort of is a acknowledgement, I think, in many ways. This is a work by Nikki Lee. And I'm going to try and get through a bunch of images as quickly as possible and try and get to some sort of dialogue. So if you really want me to stop, please tell me. This is a work by Nadine Robinson. And as you can see behind the turntables, which were actually playable throughout the exhibition, are these two huge monochromatic paintings. She called this piece Big Baby Blue as an homage to the record covers that were part of Sugar Hill, which was a huge record company in the early 80s. And this is a piece by Juan Capistrán, West Coast-based artist. And, there was an element of wanting to bring out hip-hop's sort of attitude. And I think in this piece, this is Capistrán basically sneaking into a museum in L.A. and breakdancing on top of a Carl Andre sculpture. So it's certainly tapped into that sort of irreverence. Another West Coast-based artist, Edgar Arsenal. I mean, we like to talk about this in terms of wordplay and Wittgenstein, but at the heart of it, it is sort of a funny piece. This is a work by Susan Smith Pinello, and it's just, you can't really do the justice of the video, but this was the one sort of room-sized video installation we had. And, it was funny, one of the criticisms of the show was that we didn't demonstrate enough hip-hop's misogyny. And mind you, this is back as far as 2001, 2002. But in this piece, it definitely confronted that aspect very early on. On the left side of the room-size installation, you had this video playing from Snoop Dogg's X-rated video that he did. And then on the right, you had images that were culled together from BET and MTV. And it was just shockingly similar. This is a work by Louis Gisbert. Another work by Louis Gisbert. One of the elements that we were particularly interested in is the way in that, the way in which hip hop was not like any longer a Bronx thing. It was interesting to start out in the Bronx, to think about this history that is so much a part of that place, but to also see the ways in which it changes all around the world. So Louis Gisbert was, or is, from Miami, and this piece is actually a activated car alarm system. And when you hit it, it's playing like Miami bass like crazy, and the floors, you can feel the vibration. So there was this, very simple sort of regional aspect, I think, that came out in the show as well. And this is a work by Dario Robleto. Each one of those canisters is dedicated to a certain hip-hop song. And actually, he took the vinyl record as it was and melted it down and turned it into ash and then built these music boxes, basically. Oh, man, I can't remember that. I'm sorry. I'll tell you after. This is a work by Davide Bertolchi, Italian artist. Again, just the ways in which sort of reverberations, playing around with this pirandello, playing around with turntablism, the body's connection to music and to turntablism. And then the London-based artist Chris O'Feely has a piece called Third Eye Blind from 1999. And these are two pieces by Iona Brown. These were actually in the exhibition Mass Appeal, which was also a way of taking stock of some of the artists that I didn't even know of during the One Planet show. So Iona and I have worked together a lot since then, but I was just happy to see these and have them in that show. And this is a work by Kehinde Wiley, which is one of his really, really, really early pieces. This is actually from when he was still in school at Yale. And I'm not an advocate of showing people who are still in school, but in this instance, he's a damn good painter. Okay, I'm just going to move to a few more images and then be done. So these are just some of the images from that show that I mentioned from last summer. You got to love that quote. All that I know most surely about morality and the obligations of man I owe to football. It was a show in which we were doing this during the World Cup, so there was this aspect of pure pleasure and pure play. We actually had a projector and a screen almost this size up in the gallery during the Cup. And the most fascinating thing is being based in Chelsea and being based in also in Williamsburg was how different people would come in just to watch the game. And some places you had people who were actually just coming in to see the art. Some places you had people who coming in who really just wanted to know what was going on in the game. This is a work by Vic Muniz. The bottom piece on the right is actually by Mark Bradford. You can kind of tell from the background painting, but he had been playing. We just happened to be in the studio, and I saw these crazy-looking soccer balls that he had been painting on, and it wasn't something that we were thinking about, but we were happy to include them. And this is an old piece by Mauricio Catalan called Stadia. And it's an 11v11 foosball game. And he actually used this piece first in Bologna as a means of bringing people together. there were a lot of African immigrants, particularly in the early 90s in Bologna, and he had them play against sort of the townspeople. And it was this means of sort of sparking dialogue through the game, and that's essentially what this exhibition was about. Okay. I'm just going to run through some present images quickly. This is the Menil Collection. This is the first building that Renzo Piano actually built in the United States. So it is nice to always be here and to think about that. Let's see. And the collection opened 20 years ago, actually. This is our 20th anniversary year, so 1987. Broken obelisk on the left is right behind the Rothko Chapel. So the whole sort of system of what we call a campus is kind of based around these different elements. And actually, Louis Kahn was the first architect who was contracted to actually consider making the building. And that didn't work out before he actually passed. And I think coming to Renzo Piano was this idea of, we have this entire campus, and how does that work? So at one end you have the Rothko Chapel, and right behind that is this broken obelisk by Barnett Newman. And the funny thing is, the museum was founded by John and Dominique de Menil. John de Menil actually tried to give this broken obelisk to the city of Houston in 1969, but it had to be in the name of Dr. Martin Luther King. And of course, Houston at that time, they refused. But it gives you an idea of the kind of political situation that the museum was set upon. This is the Byzantine Chapel. Cy Twombly. And Dan Flavin. And this is another campus building called Richmond Hall. The first exhibition that I did at the Menil Collection was a show called Everyday People, 20th Century Photography from the Permanent Collection. And it was about 110 images, and kind of started off with this explosion of like 30 images by Cartier-Bresson, and this is one of them. This is a piece called Tretiakov Gallery, Moscow, and it's one of the later Cartier-Bresson images. It's from 1973. The Menil is one of 4 museums that has a hand-picked selection of 385 photographs by Cartier-Bresson. So it was obviously a central element of this exhibition. And this is a work by Danny Lyon. Danny Lyon was born in Brooklyn in 1942 and actually was the photographer for SNCC in the 1960s. The first official photographer for SNCC. Show that's up now is called the David Whitney Bequest. We were recently given in about 45 works from the estate of David Whitney, who was a curator and also was a trustee at the museum. And these are just a couple images from an exhibition that's coming to the museum this fall. Bruce Nauman, A Rose Has No Teeth. And this is a show of all of his work from, well, not all of it, but a good portion of his work from the 1960s. You might recognize this piece. This is an exhibition that I'm working on for next year. It's called Neo-Hoodoo, Art for a Forgotten Faith. And this is actually a work by Radcliffe Bailey. A Halo by James Lee Byers. This is actually a rendering of the Bones of Lucy by Dario Robleto. And this is a work by Regina Jose Galindo, young Guatemalan artist. The exhibition deals with aspects of ritual and the sacred, and seeks to do that in contemporary art. Regina is one of the younger artists in the exhibition, and this piece sort of directly, for her, relates to the killing of women in Guatemala, and she's done this sort of ritualized performance piece. This one in particular was first shown at the Venice Biennial, I think 4 years ago, and actually she was the prize winner for that year for this piece. And I think that's the last image. Would love to take questions if you have any.
Thank you, Franklin. We're gonna do a short question and answer now, and I am gonna ask that you raise your hand, and I'll bring the microphone to you. We tape these lectures for the Atlanta Forum Network website, and we need questions to be spoken into the microphone. Does anyone have any questions for Franklin?
Not that good.
How's the change from New York to Texas?
Ooh, roll. It's good. Hey, it's an interesting difference, but I think being at the museum has made it pretty easy, actually. I don't plan on getting used to the heat, so I'm not going to worry about it.
Would you talk to us about where that exhibition that you're working on, will it be traveling?
Neo-Hoodoo. Mm-hmm. Yes, it will start at the Menil Collection in June, and it will then travel to PS1 in New York in the fall of the same year, and still working on the tour. I've had some conversations, and still trying to figure that out right now.
Hey, you said something about talking about the hip-hop show, one of the hip-hop shows, that you didn't need to be imbued or understanding hip-hop to get the show. But I wonder if you need to do that to understand other art exhibits. But then really what I was thinking about, and we've been talking about a lot just the past few weeks in Atlanta, hip-hop being, Atlanta being really, for now, the center of hip-hop globally. It's not really that well known among the populace here. But people are listening to these artists that are working here in Atlanta, getting it back from New York or whoever really disseminates culture. So I'm really thinking about what can we ever understand about it? Because for me, and I'm going to guess most people in the room, pretty middle-class types, and still wanting to feel close to the street, by the time we know something about a culture like hip-hop, the streets probably left that behind. So where does that put an interpreter? What position does that put you in to interpret something that you're looking at as current but may already be historical?
Yeah, that was what I was alluding to when I said, going forward and thinking about something that you fully believe to be dead as far as what you want it to be or what you considered it to be. It's a very nostalgic position to come from. And I think for me, that was the only way to approach it. And that was 2001. So I certainly don't have any illusions that I would want to be an interpreter of hip-hop today. As far as, I don't know about that, actually. As far as interpreting today via art, it's a different show. I wouldn't know how to even go about that.
We have one back here, Franklin.
In today's context, what do you think about the relevance and the importance of having the label African American be placed on an artist who's emerging or mid-career?
Yeah, I mean, it happens. There's a show that just opened yesterday in Houston called Red Hot, Asian Artists, something, something, something. And it's like, it's about 10 years too late. And, you know, it'll all sort of get sussed out. You'll remember like 2 or 3 of them. And it happens. I mean, right now, we still are working from that position. I kind of feel like, you know, certain institutional spaces need to exist. I feel like there should be an institutional space for quote unquote African American art. I don't think you need to make shows that are race specific though. Never have, never will. So I think that being an artist today is tricky, period. The way that the market works, the way that it works so quickly, the way in which criticism is sort of neglected, the power that collectors have. I was going to mention this, but I left it alone, but I can mention it. And recognizing the fact that, so this lecture is not part of the National Black Arts Festival, but Elliot Perry and Darrell Walker, who are good friends, are talking close by here. And I think that, you know, that's an important space to talk about in terms of talking about art today. The power of collectors. It's not like they decided to do a curatorial panel. They had, you know, it's about the collector. And I think this is a really scary space for younger artists. And you need to work hard on sort of protecting your work. And the whole, like, being labeled is just a matter of that. It's just another facet of protecting what you do.
How would you start collecting artwork in the hip-hop movement? Is there much artwork out there for that particular movement?
Oh, yeah, sure. I mean, I think there's just a lot of work, period. And being here, between the museums, between the alternative spaces, the contemporary, and there are good commercial spaces. So there are plenty of places to look. And if you want to be more specific than what you see, you know, that is advertised or is readily available, that's where I think the internet has been so incredibly important in terms of just exposing people to different things. So you could, I mean, even keyword searches, you know, would put you sort of in the right place. The other thing is really just to talk to artists. This is, I think, a good place for artists. There are a lot of artists working here, and they can always point you in different directions. Atlanta has its own sort of local biennial every 2 years, which will really give you a taste of what's going on here, and thus, hopefully, too, outside of the local as well. I hope that helps.
Oh, hi, Franklin. I was just, you know, you've worked on so many projects over the years and done such important work. And I wondered if you could just talk a few minutes about your own specific curatorial vision. You know, how would you sort of define it, and what do you want to see as a curator involved with institutional work, and et cetera?
It's a great question. Thank you, Carrie. I mean, I honestly try and think about, I think there are different kinds of exhibitions. And if I could put together sort of one curatorial base, it would be this idea that what we consider to be, quote unquote, high art can speak to a variety of people, a diversity of people. And it's about, you know, the subtle things. It's about how high you hang the work of art. It's about what you put next to it. It is about these sort of subtle juxtapositions. And, you know, I think in some ways that's what we were trying to do with the hip-hop show. And we had a great springboard, because it was like, okay, somebody did the show that we don't want to do. Somebody did the show with the vitrine with, like, Eminem's lyrics or Biggie's jean jacket or something. And it was never about that. It was really about, well, how do artists digest this material of popular culture? And then how do they spit it back out? And what does that tell us? I think, looking at a piece like, say, Gary Simmons with the bronze sneakers, there's a certain level of political agency to the piece like that might not exist in the way that we consume popular culture. And I still believe that the art object is this place where you can back up off it, you can think about it, it stays with you if it's good. And it is really this space for dialogue. And that is the one thing, that's why I do feel fortunate being at the Menil, because it is based on exactly the same tenets, that the sort of object can be poetic, it can be mute, it can also be poetic, in the sense that it can trigger us and take us in all different directions. The Menil Collection was first advised actually by a guy named Father Marie-Hélène Couturier, and his whole sort of philosophy was based around making art important to what he called the masses. So he worked on the Vance Chapel, he worked on ideas about creating space in which art can have something to do with our daily lives. And I think that's really the essence of it. And it just happens to come out more so perhaps in the hip-hop show or even in the Beautiful Game, which was the show where obviously we set it up so that people would come in and just sit down and nothing to force the work on them, but to put it there, to have us ponder it, and also to turn away from it at times as well. So I say that that's really where I've been coming from. And I feel the same way about doing, say, I'm doing a show on Robert Ryman, and I feel the same way about that, about looking at monochromatic canvases and having them be an equally important space for contemplation.
Okay, for time purposes, we'll take one more question if there is one. Yes.
You had mentioned the curator, David Driskell, and I was just curious who other influences have been for you as far as art critics or curatorial people.
Peter Sheldall, who's a poet and a critic, still writes. He writes for The New Yorker right now. I think that, there is this tradition that I've referred to. One of the earlier curators at MoMA was a guy named Frank O'Hara, who's probably better known for his poetry than he is for his curating. Those kind of people are really important to me because it really was about talking about the art first. It wasn't about curating it. It was about writing about it. And coming from that sort of poetry base seemed much more important than stuffing the head with the history of it all. So I'd say people like that. And then you can't get around it in many ways. I have a job now, but I've only been there for 11 months. And I was working independently for many years. So I think of people like Harold Zeman, who was from Switzerland and passed a couple of years ago. To me, that really was somebody who was I looked up to and thought about in many ways. And then thinking about, some of the things that I mentioned today, people like Ellen Locke, who wrote and curated and really threw artists together and made a movement in a way, the Harlem Renaissance. So I'd say those all of them really come to mind right now.
Okay, on behalf of the High and NBAF, I want to thank you all for coming. Again, if you are interested in looking at some of the images or hearing some of the things that Franklin said today, you can go on a website called www.atlantaforumnetwork.org, and they normally post the lectures 2 months after the lecture actually happens. So if you're interested, just keep it in mind and look on the website later on. Franklin, congratulations on the Driskell Prize, and thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.